Hello and welcome to the Refurb and Retrofit podcast. My name's Matt Malloy and I'm your host. And today we've got Elliott Grover from Greenworkx. Elliott, hello.
Hi, Matt. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. I'm very excited to have you on the podcast because your company, Greenworkx, has a pretty instrumental role in the world of retrofit. And that is because you are involved in training the potential workforce, which is going to resolve this problem that we have in the UK with retrofit. So, for those in the audience that aren't aware of your brand, tell me a little bit about what Greenworkx does and what you're about.
For sure. So, the high level kind of line, Greenworkx is building that kind of workforce solution for kind of the net zero world. We're enabling employers to hire, train, and enhance the people needed to power that sort of net zero transition, right? So that's the kind of high level thing that you'll see on our website. In terms of what we're doing in terms of the space of learning, yes, we are enabling new entrants to join, to tap into learning pathways, to find roles and ultimately get involved in retrofit. But we're also offering employers a kind of learning solution which helps them to onboard new talent quicker, and also help to set a standard, which I think is part of the kind of continuous learning model that we're trying to implement with partners.
Obviously, there's a real reason why Greenworkx exists, and that is because we have a retrofit workforce, which at the moment doesn't quite exist in the way we want it to. So, give us an idea of where we are with workforce. Where is retrofit? Who do we need, and where do we get them from?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that like this kind of problem is quite well known, it's quite well versed, and I think the industry is really good at articulating this problem. There's just not enough people. To estimate to hit those kind of net zero targets, you're going to need to upskill and reskill 3 million people by 2030, and to do that alone. When we're talking retrofit and sort of the wider kind of construction kind of industry, there's problems around experienced talent, an aging demographic that is leaving the workforce, and that's just not being replaced. So this is an industry that is shrinking, and as that talent pool gets smaller and smaller, your experienced talent goes. Companies are right now looking for that experienced talent because it's quite hard to onboard new entrants into this space, but eventually that's going to become a reality, right? So understanding what the problem is, I think companies are really seeing this. I mean, whenever I go to a conference, I remember listening to the head of people at Mears really articulating it well. Like, you have to make that industry look attractive. You have to identify these learning pathways and make sure that people know what's available and how they can get involved, and lower that barrier for entry as well to go back into the workforce.
Well, that leads me on to the next question, which is a pretty interesting one for a lot of people out there who are thinking about what they could be doing in retrofit. And that is, what do you think is sort of holding people back? What's the obstacles for people being attracted into the industry, or people who have an existing role in construction or building works that want to convert their skills into a retrofit qualification?
There tends to be a lack of understanding when it comes to career pathways, right? So there are a lot of people out there. We have a database full of 10,000 people who are interested in getting into green skills and looking to get into this sector, right? Those people might not necessarily come from the construction industry, but certainly I'll talk about them in a minute. But in terms of how they would get involved, whether it's a project manager who wants to leverage and work for, maybe say they want to work for an installation company as a project manager or as a renewables coordinator, these things are very hard to kind of articulate and kind of navigate. And certainly as someone who comes from outside the industry, working out how you go about sort of navigating that in terms of, okay, what does this role mean in the context of retrofit is quite tricky. In terms of construction, the kind of construction element in that background, I think that's quite easy. So speaking to the employers that we partner with on a recruitment basis, if you've got that background, it's very, very easy to find yourself in a company or in a role because of that experience that you have. As we go through our kind of academy process, that's very much like a sought after background. And the reason being is because you're kind of used to that environment. You kind of have a background on site, which is very, very appealing to employers who are, as I said, kind of looking for that experienced talent. The flip side of that, of course, is that experienced talent is still a declining workforce. So it's a pool to tap into for now, but it's not a pool to tap into in sort of 5-10 years from now.
Yeah, so we're talking about two different types of people that are entering into the workforce, those that are converting and those that are new entrants. In terms of once they've had training, what sort of obstacles do you find that there is during the course of the development or learning that they have that maybe holds them up to the next stage, which is after they've completed their training? We want them to get the jobs that need filling. So, what's stopping people from learning and development, then getting themselves into the employment?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's one that we've been grappling with, and I've kind of been on the forefront of at Greenworkx in terms of looking at our learning solution. So the problems we see is that there's a massive mismatch between employer expectations and what they kind of see as a good employee who they want to take a risk on and hire, and the experience of a recently certified kind of trainee. And and looking at it from that perspective, you have people, if we take the world of kind of say a retrofit assessor, they'll have a 3 to 5 day course. After finishing that course, they'll come out and they'll be told, yes, you are now job ready. And as we know from employers, and I'm sure there'll be people listening to this who go, no way, right? You're not job ready. You need that experience, whether that's creating floor plans or being on site. There is so much more to the role that is creating a very, very long development plan, which businesses are kind of a bit hesitant to deal with. That's kind of a barrier, right? Particularly when we're talking about this space where it's largely around SMEs or kind of panels of assessors that are employed on a sort of contracted basis, self-employed basis. It's a risk, and companies have been burned before, so they're very reluctant to hire that trainee talent. What is changing as well, and what we can see, is that there is, an articulation to solving this problem is through learning and development, and it's using learning and development as a tool to hit some of those key business goals and flatten out that learning curve. I'll get onto the solution in a moment about how we see that, because I don't want to give it away too early in the podcast, Matt, because that got to keep the listeners
Yeah, don't blow,
listening.
don't do the money. No.
Yeah, not here to gloat, but that's where we see how we fit in.
Are you seeing then a range of experience from the people that are applying as new entrants? Because it sounds like there's quite a diversity to the types of people that want to get into this sort of employment. And is there really an opportunity for people with no construction experience in the sector?
On that, I mean, the reality is there kind of has to be. I mean, if you're looking at, when we articulated the problem earlier, we need new entrants into this space. That is a reality. The demands of the industry, the demands of new kind of projects, the whole kind of net zero space. We're going to need 3 million people to come into this space in order to achieve those obligations. I mean, even today we're talking about the installation of more heat pumps, right? As we are doing that, there needs to be open up those barriers, because if we keep them there, this workforce is not going to be replenished enough to make those goals happen. Through our academy, and I'm kind of more interested in talking about the sort of learning that we have after the academy, but we do know that employers, like we said, in terms of that mismatch, they value things like you from a construction background, because you have almost a leg up on that kind of competition. That works for now, and it will work in the next 2 years. And again, if you're looking at funding announcements in the next couple of months, you want to shorten that onboarding journey as much as you can. So you probably want someone from a construction background, because they're a better candidate for you than someone who is completely green to the space. But that's a short-sighted kind of measure when you compare to the long-term goals that need to happen.
I mean, I'd like to expand on that, because essentially there is a question about the suitability of all candidates for the retrofit roles, in terms of a lot of retrofit skills are not skills that anybody has, which is why they need to be taught. But I'm just going to expand on something you said earlier. The courses that are run for retrofitting insulation, for heat pumps, all of these various retraining courses are regulated. And so the content can't be that different. The qualifications are also regulated as well to make sure that people achieve certain standards. But the next thing that we're talking about is people's suitability for employment. And there is something about being suitable for employment which you only gain from experience. But what's your sort of feedback that you've had from people that have attended your courses about what they're being asked for from new employers?
So in terms of the general feedback that we've had from employers, is that they've had trainee recruits before, they have had recently certified people. they don't want to take the risk. It requires a much longer learning curve because it's, the course that they've been on has been, again, it's only a couple of days. It's too steep for them to be a really reliable and productive member of staff that they need, particularly when you look at the kind of hiring cycles of this industry. I mean, because it's so bid driven, it spikes and peaks and troughs, and that makes it very difficult to kind of plan ahead because you need people now. In terms of our what our people are saying when they go to interview with external companies that perhaps aren't our partners, it's quite obvious that they're trainees, for example, but they'll be asked to be like, okay, how many EPCs have you done? For example, if we're talking about sort of energy assessors in that space, there's an expectation of that kind of like it goes back to that mismatch between what certification means and what experience means, and how do we kind of bridge that gap, which is where our kind of learning solution really comes into its own.
Right. Well, I'm very excited to get on to a description about that. But can we agree on something first before we get there? Not all training providers are created equal. And the difference between certain training providers is that they will provide you with a course that will give you a qualification, but they're not necessarily going to provide you with the backing to get the employment. And let's be very clear with the audience that are listening to this podcast. That is one of the differences that you provide, because you're not just providing training, which lots of people can do and are regulated to do with varying degrees of success, judging by the feedback we've had at various shows and talking to people on the ground. But the difference between yourself and some other providers is that you're not just getting people trained, you're trying to get people employed. So try to explain. So let's get to the meat of it then. Tell me what it is about what Greenworkx does that makes the candidates that goes through your training that much better at gaining employment. What is the secret sauce?
So there's a couple of things there. In terms of how we would differentiate ourselves from the other learning providers that are out there. So in terms of what differentiates Greenworkx from the market in terms of like learning providers, how are we different? What's the secret sauce? And I think you've already touched on it in the question, is that the focus is on employment and the flow of work. We've looked at it from the partners that we have and the employees that we have and say, okay, how do we create assessors that are going to be able to optimize and get a return on investment for the employer? And that's the same. So by looking at that, you kind of take a step back and go, okay, the course in terms of certification will always be there. There's some great learning providers out there for sure, but the problem there is that, like in any way that you've ever learned anything, to expect to learn material and be competent across 5 days is just it's a very steep learning curve. And what we need to do, and in Greenworkx and how we think about learning design, is that we need to flatten that curve as much as possible. So that comes in not just at the stage where we're dealing with the candidate, it's at the stage that we're saying, okay, you've got the course, you've got certification. What's happening between that and going into the role? How do we build and extend that learning onwards? And how do we help you in the flow of work? And I think in the flow of work is the guiding message of saying, okay, learning doesn't stop just because you've got the qualification. You need to keep going, keep moving in, and we need to make learning as relevant as possible to your role, because that's how you build confidence and competence in what you do. With that, and the way we do that, not to give away all the special sauce, but we're looking at learning design and we're looking at tools and scenarios that make sure that you can access that at point of need, rather than...
Okay, well, can I interrupt you there then? Because are you telling me that you're not like some providers that provide training and then sell another course that trains you how to get employment, which I find a little bit disreputable? I mean, it's kind of like defeating the object of doing the training. You're slightly different, are you?
Well, it's like shutting the stable door after the horse has bolted, right?
Yeah, I mean, if somebody's paid for a course and they're struggling to get employment, then the course or something to do with the course hasn't done its job. So what are you doing different then?
Yeah, so I mean that is the way you kind of described something that we think is fundamentally probably at odds with the way we think learning should be delivered, and learning should be delivered in terms of how it should be used to hit kind of those business outcomes, right? And I think, Matt, think about any time you've ever learned something, it probably didn't end at the time that you got the piece of paper that said you had it. So how do we embed learning into businesses and candidates and trainees in a way that helps them to keep going? And that's kind of different. And we don't have that stop and start kind of, okay, here's a course, you've qualified, good, okay, you're there. Oh, okay, you're not, the employee readiness is not necessarily there, for example. Oh, there's another course, there you go, you're now employee ready. I mean, again, that takes you through that kind of stop start kind of steep learning curve, which we're trying to avoid altogether. That's done through learning design, right? And that's saying, okay, this journey is about competence. It's not about complying with a standard and certifying and saying, there you go, you're done, you're an assessor now. And that's where the kind of difference is that we see it.
Right. I'm going to ask you a question then about, maybe is it because the Greenworkx team and the premise behind the company comes from a space that wasn't entirely located in construction. You are not people who have come from building to then teach building and retrofit skills. You're experts at training who have then used your expertise to make the learning process better. Am I understood that correctly?
Yes, that's right. So our a lot of our founding team are ex-Multiverse, so that's a tech sort of unicorn that specialized in apprenticeships and is now kind of, how do you leverage learning to hit key business outcomes and ROI. Myself, my background is also in tech, but it's around utilizing some like key HR functions like well-being and learning development to hit key business outcomes. So whether that's onboarding time, whether that's helping businesses to generate more of a return, and how do we leverage that in a way that makes sense to make sure that the businesses are positively impacted. To say that is where we come from. It's not to say that we don't have experts on field. You know, we have partners and we have people in the team who have a great deal of experts and subject matter knowledge, but we do come from outside that space, which gives us a perspective on that learning and how we can deliver learning.
Okay, well, I'll ask you. I mean, this might be a difficult question for you to answer then. Is it not possible in some sections of the building and construction community that you encounter resistance because of that? I'm not saying that it's a partisan environment, but there are some people that need you to have lugged muck before you can participate in this. I can say that from a position of somebody who has lugged muck, but also worked on a lot of keyboards during a period of time. I found resistance myself. I mean, how do you overcome that resistance to your learning process?
For sure, and there are, as we have conversations, there are retrofit leads and people who say, okay, you have to have 5 years in the built environment, you have to understand X, Y, and Z, you have to know how to present yourself on site. These things are great, but it is still, I mean, again, like we said, in terms of the problem, that demographic is shrinking too quickly and the demand is scaling too rapidly, right? So who you need to bring into the workforce are people who are new entrants. It's just a non-brainer. And it goes back to your talking when we spoke about kind of learning providers. They are great at the subject matter knowledge. Like courses are great. It's a high standard of technical ability. It's fantastic. Has it got people? Has it created candidates who are able to go in and be job ready? Employers would say otherwise, right? So how do you bridge that gap? And that is where we come in, because we have this perspective from outside the sector.
Okay, well, let me just pursue that line then a little bit then, because let's talk a bit about the new entrants specifically rather than the people who want to retrain into retrofit skills, who are existing construction professionals. The new entrants are a younger generation. So is there something that needs to be done, or is there something that you're doing that's making your training more relevant and easy to consume for that generation?
Yeah, for sure. I think in terms of that kind of younger generation, that there's levels of awareness and kind of engagement, which is definitely a big thing that a lot of retrofit leads will talk about. Not just engagement in terms of on site with the consumer, the homeowner of the property, but also just like new entrants from a talent perspective. We provide those kind of learning pathways that tell you, okay, what are you interested in? How do you, what role would be a good fit for you? So that happens at the start of our process. Through the academy, and our online solution, it's much more digestible. It's bite-sized, it's interactive, it's videos and tools that are designed to promote engagement. And make sure that you're learning in a sustainable way. It's amazing how many people we're talking to who I ask a question like, okay, so how does learning development work for you? And they go, oh, I go back to my stack of PDFs and I pick out the 3 things to do, and then I share them with my assessors the next week. And it's like, okay, how is that sustainable, and how does that help not just the new generation, but how do you build up junior staff from a very analog kind of way of doing things? We build the learning with the idea of it being bite size. It has to be accessible. It has to be available on a laptop, phone, you name it, and it has to be good to grab your attention. And that comes back from our background in engagement. Like, if people aren't using your solution, what's the good of the solution?
These people that are listening to the podcast that maybe are thinking about a career retrofit, what sort of people should they be? I mean, let's talk a little bit about the environment that retrofit assessors go into. It's people's homes. You need to be personable. You need to be good at talking to people. If you are involved in assessments, the idea that you're not a methodical person is possibly going to mean that you're not ideally suited to retrofit, which requires a lot of analytical detail. So, can we maybe have an idea, give us an idea of the types of qualities that people need to have? Not everybody's going to be suited for every role in retrofit. So how is it that your system provides people with an insight into what qualities they need?
So that insight is very much driven by the employers that we work with and partner with, right? So the more we learn with our interactions, the more people that we place in those roles, the more we understand, okay, what is needed in these positions. And that's down to employer expectations. And again, whilst each employer will have a different kind of viewpoint, there are some similarities that we then start to build up in terms of a good profile, and then that impacts on the screening process. The best things that we do, and I think this ties back into our learning design, which is, I guess, kind of the crux of what we're about and why we're different, is that there's a very clear target and goal for you to finish at, right? So the learning is relevant to you in your journey. Now, we need to understand motivations and so on, but we need to be able to tell you that through our learning, you are going to be better and more competent in your job. To do that, you really need to understand why you are learning what you're learning. And that matches whether you're talking about some of our academies or whether you're talking about our online learning stuff. This needs to be relevant to you in your role. It needs to align with how you want to develop in your career. It needs to it takes you from a new assessor who might be the first week on the job to a fully onboarded, productive member of staff later on down the line, and take you on that journey. And if we don't have that foresight and that understanding, the learning kind of drops away because people will just not engage with that.
Okay, I can understand. That's a good way of understanding how to make sure people who go through the learning process through to employment don't get disinterested. But maybe could we shift a little bit over towards the benefit to employers?
Mm.
So the large majority of retrofit works needs to be completed by SMEs in this country, and there's an understandable reluctance from SMEs to put people through retraining. You take somebody out of the workforce for 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, they're not earning a crust for the company. What is the benefit to employers of using this type of training that you provide, and how quickly do they become employable but back in the company?
Well, it's a great question. I think this comes back to when we were articulating those problems, because we've got the kind of learning and certification kind of environment over here, and it's quite divorced from if you're an SME, it's quite divorced from in the flow of work over here. And this is what we need to be employable. This is what we need to have a productive member of staff. This is important, right? So the way we are differentiating is that, through the learning solution that we have, it's done in the flow of work. It's there. It's available for, say, an assessor to say, okay, like, I'm going on site next week. I'm going to do a full retrofit assessment. I want to brush up on this, this, and this. I'm gonna drop into my learning and just build up my confidence before I go onto site. So it's not 2 or 3 days out of your time, and it's making that person more valuable because all of that is accessible either on a phone or on a laptop or an iPad. Again, like, these assessors are mobile. You need to have a mobile solution alongside it, and this helps to move within that flow of work, and that's something that we're quite passionate about because, again, are people going to use it? how are they using it, and are they using it to achieve the business outcome, which is are more competent in their role, which affects that kind of SME bottom line. The benefit, as I see it, in terms of with some of these SMEs, I mean, again, you're talking about companies that probably haven't invested in an L&D function. They've not invested in well, there might be an HR manager who's overlooking 5 different functions, and in this space, talent and recruitment is the overriding priority there. And as much as your day to day, through using us, you're helping on that onboarding journey. We can support on that. We're not saying that there's going to be, we're not going to be able to replace the shadowing and the other ways that people learn in terms of like the communication with their managers, but we can help put a dent in that onboarding time, and then you're going to have more productive members of staff, and that's where we want to land. And the value of that is that you're not investing in building out that L&D structure in house, and we are then on that journey of saying this L&D, instead of being divorced and somewhere over there, is now really like tied to that business outcome and that return on investment that you want to get.
AI is definitely going to have an impact. Technology is changed so much in the training environment. Tell me a little bit about how you can see training processes and tools that you use for training changing in the very near future then.
So in terms of some of the AI supports, I mean, we're utilizing AI in a lot of different ways in our testing right now. How to support someone in terms of if they've got a question, that might be about PAS 2035. How do you build that in? And, like you said, looking at the technical. We're also using that in kind of front-facing roles, so people who have to talk to people. There's really interesting stuff that you can do there in terms of, and I've done this very recently, had a conversation with an AI, and then I get scored on how I performed, right? So that's really interesting when we talk about resident engagement, for example. It's really interesting when we talk about people who might be involved in debt advice or fuel debt advice or fuel poverty, because you need to deal with a vulnerable customer, and how do you work on tone of voice? How do you develop and build that? These are examples of things that we're looking at applying AI to at the moment. So in terms of that, Greenworkx specifically, watch this space.
Well, I'm really excited about that. I mean, AI does a great job of coaching people. There's tools like Read AI and Otter, and as you say, they grade the way that your conversation comes across after the transcript comes back from a meeting. So they could be an incredible tool for people just being able to communicate better with certain types of customer and transform the way that information is passed. That is exciting. Now, we've covered pretty much everything that the training space has to offer. Greenworkx is a phenomenal company in a space which has become a little bit moribund with a few dominant characters. So it's very refreshing to have the opportunity to talk to you, Elliott. But where can people find you on the web? I obviously put them in the show notes, but where should they find Greenworkx?
Talk to me. Please feel free to reach out to me directly on LinkedIn. Always happy to have a conversation. Tell me if I got it right. Tell me if I got it wrong. That's great. Always happy to learn. We also have a area of our website which we would be happy to direct people to. It will show you a little bit more about our learning solutions, and how we think we can support those SME employers. And yeah, I mean, personally, I'll share my LinkedIn as well. Always happy to connect with someone and share best practice.
So if you're in need of training and you are hoping to build your retrofit workforce, I would absolutely recommend there are other training providers available. But if you want a refreshing approach to your training, I recommend you take a look at Greenworkx, a very exciting company. Elliott, it's been a pleasure having you on the podcast, and I look forward to meeting you at the next trade show.
Matt, absolute pleasure. Looking forward to meeting you in person too. Thank you for having me on.